The first time Lucas kissed me, I knew I should have stopped him. I knew it was crossing a line I couldn't uncross, stepping into a territory that could ruin everything I'd worked for. But the moment his lips brushed mine, soft and deliberate, all my carefully built walls came crashing down. It happened late one night in the library of his mother's sprawling estate. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone else has gone to bed, leaving behind only the faint creak of old wood and the distant hum of the wind outside. We'd been working on seating charts for one of Evelyn Carter's high-profile charity galas. I was her assistant, after all, and Lucas, he was supposed to be nothing more than her son, her frustratingly charming, infuriatingly confident son. From the moment I'd met Lucas, I'd known he was trouble. At 25, he was the kind of man who wore his privilege like a second skin, effortlessly charming everyone around him with a crooked smile and an air of rebellion. He didn't care about his mother's corporate empire, nor did he seem interested in the responsibilities that came with his last name. He was an artist, or so he claimed, spending his days painting in the estate's sunroom, and his nights flitting between bars and gallery openings. But there was something about him that made it impossible to ignore him. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, with a mix of arrogance and vulnerability that hinted at a deeper complexity. Or maybe it was the way he looked at me sometimes, his gaze lingering just a second too long, as if he saw something in me no one else did. That night, as we sat across from each other at the long oak table, I could feel his eyes on me. I tried to focus on the papers in front of me, on the neat rows of names and numbers, but the air between us felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. "You're awfully quiet tonight," he said, his voice low and teasing. "I'm working," I replied, keeping my eyes on the list. "You're always working," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Do you ever take a break?" I shot him a look, but his smile only widened. "Some of us have responsibilities," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "And some of us know how to enjoy life," he countered, his voice softening. "When's the last time you did something just for yourself?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. He wasn't teasing anymore. His gaze was steady, searching, and it made my pulse quicken in a way I wasn't prepared for. "I'm fine," I said finally, looking back down at the papers. "Let's just finish this." But Lucas didn't move. Instead, he stood, walking around the table until he was standing beside me. My breath hitched as he leaned down, his hand brushing mine as he reached for one of the papers. "You're not fine," he said softly, his voice so close it sent a shiver down my spine. "Lucas?" I started, but he cut me off. "Tell me to stop," he said, his eyes locked on mine. I should have told him to walk away, to go back to his studio or his bedroom or anywhere else that wasn't here, with me. But I didn't, and when he leaned in and kissed me, the world fell away. When Evelyn Carter first hired me, I thought I had landed the dream job. She was the type of woman you read about in magazines, sharp, powerful, and relentless. At 59, she ran one of the most successful private investment firms on the East Coast. Her reputation was legendary, both for her business acumen and her icy demeanor. To some, she was intimidating. To me, she was an opportunity. I was 42, newly divorced, and determined to rebuild my life. My marriage had ended quietly, without fireworks or betrayals, just the slow erosion of love that left us more like roommates than partners. After 18 years together, my ex-husband and I signed the papers and went our separate ways. He moved to a new state, started over with someone younger, while I stayed behind, pouring myself into my work as a personal assistant. The job with Evelyn came at the perfect time. She needed someone efficient, discreet, and unflappable to manage her demanding schedule, and I needed a challenge. From the moment I stepped into her immaculate penthouse office for the interview, I knew I wanted the position. Evelyn didn't suffer fools, and I liked that about her. For the first few weeks, my days were consumed by organizing her life, coordinating meetings, fielding endless calls, and making sure her sprawling estate ran like a well-oiled machine. It was exhausting but fulfilling, a welcome distraction from the quiet loneliness that had crept into my life after the divorce. And then there was Lucas. The first time I met him, I was sitting in the estate's kitchen, going over Evelyn's schedule for the week. He strolled in barefoot, wearing paint-streaked jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, a half-eaten apple in his hand. "You must be the new assistant," he said, leaning casually against the counter. I glanced up, startled by his sudden appearance. He looked nothing like his mother. Where she was sharp and severe, he was relaxed and effortlessly charismatic. His hair was dark and unruly, his smile lopsided and easy. "Yes," I said, standing to introduce myself. "I'm Claire." "Lucas," he replied, his handshake firm but unpretentious. "Good luck keeping up with my mother. She'll eat you alive if you're not careful." His tone was teasing, but there was an edge of truth to his words. I smiled politely, unsure of how to respond. From that moment, Lucas was a constant presence in the house. He wasn't involved in his mother's business, a fact that clearly frustrated Evelyn. Instead, he spent his days painting in the sunroom or disappearing for hours at a time, only to return with stories about gallery openings or parties. He was the polar opposite of Evelyn. Carefree, creative, and seemingly uninterested in the world of finance and power she had built. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. He was Evelyn's son, an extension of her world but not part of my job. I saw him as little more than a minor distraction, someone who occasionally wandered into the kitchen while I worked or made light-hearted jokes during dinner. But over time, I began to notice the way he looked at me. It wasn't overt, at least not at first. It was subtle, a glance that lingered a little too long, a smile that felt just a bit too personal. I told myself I was imagining it, that Lucas was just naturally charming. The kind of man who flirted without even realizing it. But as the weeks turned into months, it became harder to ignore. He started finding excuses to talk to me, stopping by my office to ask questions he didn't really need answers to, or lingering in the kitchen while I prepared Evelyn's tea. "You work too much," he said one afternoon, leaning against the counter as I flipped through Evelyn's latest itinerary. "That's the job," I replied without looking up. "You ever do anything for yourself?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're always running around taking care of my mother. When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" I didn't have an answer for that. Working for Evelyn was both a privilege and a challenge. She was a perfectionist, the kind of woman who expected nothing less than excellence from everyone around her. I admired her drive, her ability to command a room with a single glance, but I also saw the toll it took on those closest to her. Lucas bore the brunt of it. Evelyn loved her son, that much was clear, but she didn't understand him. To her, his refusal to join the family business was a personal affront, a rejection of everything she had worked to build. Their relationship was tense, filled with pointed remarks and unspoken resentments. I often found myself caught in the middle, trying to mediate their arguments or deflect Evelyn's frustration when Lucas failed to meet her expectations. It was an unspoken part of my job, one I hadn't anticipated but couldn't avoid. One evening, after a particularly heated argument over dinner, Lucas found me in the library, where I was tidying up the papers Evelyn had left behind. "Do you ever get tired of being her buffer?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. I looked up, surprised by the bitterness in his tone. "She's my boss," I said simply. "She treats you like a servant," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "You deserve better than this." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "I'm fine, Lucas," I said finally, turning back to the papers. "You don't need to worry about me." "Maybe I want to," he replied, his voice soft but firm. After that night, something shifted between us. Lucas became bolder, his flirtation more direct. He started finding excuses to be near me, whether it was lingering in the library while I worked or inviting me to join him for a drink on the terrace after Evelyn had gone to bed. At first, I tried to keep my distance, reminding myself that he was Evelyn's son, that any involvement with him would jeopardize everything I had worked for. But Lucas had a way of breaking down my defenses, his charm and wit disarming me in ways I hadn't expected. And then there were the moments of vulnerability, the glimpses of the man beneath the bravado. He told me about his struggles with living in his mother's shadow, about how he felt like he could never be enough for her. "I'm not her," he said one night, his voice tinged with sadness. "I never will be, and she'll never let me forget that." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Evelyn loved him in her own way, but the words felt hollow. Instead, I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to be her," I said softly. "You just have to be you." Our eyes met, and in that moment, the tension between us became almost unbearable. I knew then that it was only a matter of time before the line we'd been walking would be crossed. The night it all changed, the house was unusually quiet. Evelyn had gone to bed hours earlier, her sharp voice finally silenced for the day. The estate, sprawling and opulent, seemed to breathe easier in her absence. I was in the library, a grand room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the faint scent of old paper, finishing up last-minute preparations for the gala she was hosting the next evening. I was exhausted. The day had been a blur of phone calls, spreadsheets, and endless demands. But I'd long since learned how to push through, to keep going, even when every muscle in my body begged me to stop. I didn't hear Lucas enter the room until he spoke. "Working late again?" His voice startled me, and I looked up from the seating chart I'd been poring over. He was leaning casually against the doorframe, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. He looked relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made my pulse quicken. "Someone has to make sure your mother's gala doesn't fall apart," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He smirked, stepping further into the room. "You work too hard, Claire." "And you don't work enough," I countered, raising an eyebrow at him. He laughed softly, the sound warm and rich, and crossed the room to stand beside me. "Fair point," he said, his voice quieter now. "But even you deserve a break." I shook my head, returning my focus to the chart in front of me. "The gala is tomorrow. I can't afford to take a break right now." "Let me help," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting beside me. "You? Help with a seating chart?" I asked, giving him a skeptical look. "I'm not as useless as my mother thinks," he said, his tone laced with both humor and bitterness. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I slid the chart toward him, handing him a pen. "Fine. You can match up the donors with the board members. Let's see if you can keep them from killing each other." He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing mine, and I tried to ignore the way my skin prickled at the contact. We worked in silence for a while, the sound of the pen scratching against paper filling the room. But I was acutely aware of him, of the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his fingers moved with a quiet confidence. "You're good at this," I said finally, surprised at how neatly he'd organized the names. He glanced at me, his lips curving into a small smile. "Told you I wasn't useless." Our eyes met, and the air between us shifted. It was subtle at first, an undercurrent of tension that had been building for weeks finally breaking the surface. "Why do you do it?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft. "Do what?" "Put up with her," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the main house. "She's my boss," I said simply, though the words felt inadequate. "Is that the only reason?" he pressed, his gaze searching mine. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Evelyn's difficult, yes, but she's also brilliant, and I respect her." He leaned back slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my heart race. "You're nothing like her, you know," he said after a moment. I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "She's cold, calculating, but you?" He trailed off, his eyes flicking to my lips for just a second before meeting my gaze again. "You're different." I didn't know what to say. The way he was looking at me, the raw honesty in his voice, it left me breathless. "Lucas," I started, but he cut me off. "I mean it, Claire," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're incredible, and you don't even see it." The room seemed to shrink around us, the space between us vanishing as he leaned closer. My mind screamed at me to stop this, to walk away before it was too late. But my body betrayed me, my heart pounding in my chest as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. And then he kissed me. It wasn't hesitant or unsure. His lips met mine with a confidence that made my breath catch, his hand sliding to the back of my neck as he pulled me closer. For a moment, I froze, my mind racing with every reason why this was a terrible idea. But then something in me gave way. I kissed him back, my hands finding their way to his chest, gripping the fabric of his shirt as if it were the only thing grounding me. The world outside the library ceased to exist. the weight of my responsibilities and fears melting away in the heat of the moment. "Claire," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with longing. The sound of my name on his lips sent a shiver through me, and I pulled back slightly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is wrong," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Then why does it feel so right?" he countered, his forehead resting against mine. I didn't have an answer. It didn't end there. His hands found their way to my waist, pulling me onto his lap as he kissed me again, deeper this time, his lips leaving a trail of fire along my jawline and down my neck. Every rational thought fled my mind as I gave in to him completely. The tension that had been building between us for weeks finally erupted. The passion between us undeniable and all-consuming. We didn't leave the library that night. When it was over, we sat in silence for a while, the weight of what we'd done settling over us like a heavy blanket. "This changes everything," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good," he replied, his hand brushing against mine, "because I don't want to pretend anymore." The next morning, I woke up with a mix of exhilaration and dread. The memory of Lucas's touch, the way he'd looked at me, lingered in my mind like a vivid dream. But the reality of what we'd done and the consequences it could bring loomed large. I knew I couldn't let this happen again. Lucas was Evelyn's son, and if she ever found out, but even as I told myself it was a mistake, a part of me already knew the truth. This was only the beginning. I told myself it was a mistake, that it couldn't happen again. The next morning, as I stood in the kitchen pouring Evelyn's tea, I replayed every moment from the night before. The kiss, the way Lucas's hands felt on my skin, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. My chest tightened with a mix of exhilaration and guilt. But when Lucas strolled into the kitchen, barefoot and shirtless, the faintest smirk playing on his lips, I knew I was lying to myself. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and teasing, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I stiffened, glancing at the clock to make sure Evelyn wasn't awake yet. "You shouldn't be here," I hissed under my breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Relax," he said, grabbing an apple from the bowl on the counter. "She won't be up for another hour." "Lucas? You're beautiful when you're flustered, you know that?" he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my pulse racing as he leaned against the counter, too close for comfort. "This has to stop," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Does it?" he asked, his voice low and full of quiet confidence. "Because I don't think you want it to." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words never came. Instead, I found myself staring at him, at the faint stubble on his jaw, the warmth in his eyes, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Before I could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Lucas gave me a quick wink and disappeared out the back door, leaving me breathless and reeling. That evening, Evelyn hosted one of her infamous dinner parties. The house was filled with high-profile guests, CEOs, politicians, philanthropists, all of them impeccably dressed and vying for her attention. I moved through the room, clipboard in hand, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Lucas, of course, was nowhere to be found. He hated these events, and Evelyn had long since stopped trying to make him attend. By the time the last guest had left, it was nearly midnight. Evelyn retreated to her study with a glass of scotch, leaving me to oversee the cleanup. The house was quiet again, the clinking of dishes the only sound as the staff cleared the dining room. I was in the library, tidying up stray papers, when I felt him behind me. "You looked stunning tonight," Lucas said, his voice low and intimate. I turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, dressed in a simple white shirt and dark jeans. He looked casual but devastatingly handsome, and my resolve crumbled the moment our eyes met. "You shouldn't be here," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "And yet, here I am," he replied, stepping into the room. Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his hand brushing mine as he took the papers from my grasp and set them on the table. "Lucas, stop," he said softly, his fingers trailing along my jawline. "Tell me you don't feel this, and I'll walk away." "But if you do..." I didn't let him finish. This time it was me who closed the distance, pulling him into a kiss that was every bit as electric as the night before. After that night, there was no going back. We fell into a rhythm of stolen moments and secret meetings, the intensity of our connection growing with every encounter. During the day, I was the consummate professional, handling Evelyn's demands with practiced efficiency. But at night, when the house was quiet and the rest of the world had faded away, Lucas and I became something else entirely. We weren't careless, but the risk of getting caught only added to the thrill. Every glance across the room, every accidental touch, every whispered word felt like a secret we couldn't share with anyone else. One night, Lucas led me to the sunroom where he painted. The space was bathed in moonlight, the smell of turpentine and canvas thick in the air. "I want to show you something," he said, guiding me to an easel covered with a draped cloth. When he pulled the cloth away, I gasped. It was a painting of me, not a perfect likeness, but an impressionistic study of the way he saw me. The colors were warm and soft, the brushstrokes bold and confident. "You painted this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his hand brushing mine. "You inspire me," he said simply. I turned to him, my heart pounding. "Lucas, I mean it," he said, stepping closer. "You make me want to be better, to be more." I kissed him then, the emotions between us too overwhelming to put into words. Of course, it couldn't all be stolen kisses and whispered confessions. The closer we grew, the harder it became to hide our relationship. One afternoon, Evelyn caught us in a moment that came dangerously close to exposing the truth. I was in the garden, overseeing the setup for another one of her events, when Lucas appeared, a playful grin on his face. "Careful," I whispered as he approached. "Your mother's inside." "Let her see," he teased, leaning in as if to kiss me. I stepped back, my heart racing. "Lucas, I'm serious. She can't know about this." "Why not?" he asked, his tone turning serious. "Why are we hiding?" Before I could answer, Evelyn's sharp voice cut through the air. "Claire, where are you?" I froze, my stomach dropping. Lucas gave me a quick wink and disappeared around the corner, leaving me to face Evelyn alone. She approached me with her usual air of authority, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied me. "What were you doing?" she asked, her tone suspicious. "Just checking on the garden," I replied, forcing a calm smile. She didn't press further, but the look she gave me lingered, a silent warning that she was watching. Despite the risks, Lucas and I couldn't seem to stay away from each other. One night, as we lay tangled together in his room, he opened up to me in a way he never had before. "I feel like I'm always disappointing her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother?" I asked, brushing a hand through his hair. He nodded, his gaze distant. "She spent her whole life building this empire, and all I've done is prove I don't fit into it." "You're not a disappointment," I said firmly. "You're just different. And that's okay." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "You really think so?" "I know so," I said, kissing him softly. In moments like that, I saw the man beneath the bravado, the boy who wanted nothing more than to be loved for who he was. But as our connection deepened, so did the risks. Evelyn wasn't a fool, and she began to notice the subtle shifts in my demeanor, the way I avoided eye contact when Lucas was around, the way I seemed distracted during meetings. One evening, as I sat in the library reviewing contracts, she entered the room and closed the door behind her. "Claire," she said, her tone sharp. "Is there something you're not telling me?" My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. "Of course not, Mrs. Carter." She studied me for a long moment, her piercing gaze cutting through me. "Good," she said finally. "Because I don't tolerate betrayal." As she left the room, I let out a shaky breath, the weight of her words settling over me like a storm cloud. I knew then that our time was running out. The tension between Lucas and me was intoxicating, but the weight of secrecy was beginning to crack the foundation of what we'd built. Evelyn was too sharp, too meticulous, and her growing suspicion felt like a noose tightening around us. The first real sign of danger came one morning during breakfast. Evelyn sat at the head of a long mahogany table, scanning the day's agenda on her tablet while I poured her tea. Lucas strolled in, his hair slightly tousled, wearing that smug grin that always left me equal parts exasperated and enthralled. "You're up early," Evelyn remarked, her tone clipped. "Couldn't sleep," Lucas said, grabbing an apple from the bowl in the center of the table. Evelyn barely glanced at him. "Perhaps if you focused on something productive during the day, you wouldn't waste your nights." Lucas rolled his eyes but said nothing, sitting across from her. I tried to keep my expression neutral as I handed her the tea, but the intensity of Lucas's gaze on me was impossible to ignore. "Claire," Evelyn said suddenly, snapping my attention back to her. "I'll need you to confirm the caterers for tomorrow's event and finalize the seating chart. And do remind Lucas that he's expected to attend this time." "Noted," I said, keeping my tone even. "And Lucas," she added, her eyes narrowing as she finally looked at him, "try not to embarrass yourself, or me." Lucas smirked, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his frustration. "Of course, Mother," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. I excused myself, escaping to the kitchen where I could catch my breath. Moments later, Lucas appeared, leaning against the doorway with that same infuriating grin. "She's impossible, isn't she?" he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Lucas, you can't keep antagonizing her," I said, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "Why not? She deserves it." "She's your mother," I said firmly. "And she's my boss. We can't—" "Stop," he interrupted, stepping closer. "You're always so worried about her. What about us?" "Us," I repeated, my heart racing. "Yes, Claire. Us," he said, his voice softening. "I'm not letting her come between us. Not now, not ever." His words sent a shiver through me, but they also filled me with dread. As much as I wanted to believe in the bubble we'd created, I knew it couldn't last. It happened the night of Evelyn's gala. The estate was filled with guests, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses echoing through the grand hall. I'd spent the evening ensuring everything ran smoothly, weaving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Lucas had avoided the event for most of the night, much to Evelyn's irritation. But just as the speeches began, he appeared, slipping into the back of the room. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile. I shouldn't have let my guard down. Later, when the event began to wind down, I found myself in the library, organizing the contracts from the evening. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. I didn't hear him come in, but I felt his presence before he spoke. "You look stunning tonight," Lucas said, his voice low and warm. I glanced up, my breath catching at the sight of him. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his tie slightly loosened, his hair falling messily across his forehead. "Lucas, not here," I whispered, glancing at the door. He ignored me, stepping closer until he was leaning against the desk, his hand brushing mine. "You've been avoiding me all night." "I've been working," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Claire," he murmured, his gaze locking onto mine. "I can't keep pretending like this is just a fling. You mean too much to me." His words left me breathless, and for a moment I let myself believe we could make this work. But before I could respond, the door opened. "Claire, I need you to." Evelyn's voice cut off abruptly as she stepped into the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn's sharp gaze darted between Lucas and me, her eyes narrowing as the truth dawned on her. The tension in the room was suffocating, the weight of her fury pressing down on us like a tidal wave. "What," she said slowly, her voice dangerously calm, "is going on here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't make things worse. "It's not what you think," I managed to say, though the lie felt hollow even to me. Evelyn's eyes narrowed further, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Don't insult my intelligence, Claire." "Mother, stop," Lucas said, stepping forward. "Stop," Evelyn snapped, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any idea what this will do to me?" "To her?" She turned to me, her expression icy. "I trusted you, Claire. I brought you into my home, into my life, and this is how you repay me?" "Evelyn, Don't," she interrupted, her voice cold and cutting. "You've made your choices, Claire, and now you'll face the consequences." Her words were a dagger to the heart, and I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "Mother, this isn't her fault," Lucas said, his voice steady but firm. "I pursued her. I wanted this." "And she should have known better," Evelyn snapped, her gaze never leaving mine. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Finally she turned to Lucas, her expression softening only slightly. "You," she said, her voice quieter now. "You've always been reckless, Lucas. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined." She turned back to me, her eyes hard. "You're done here, Claire. Pack your things and leave. Tonight." I spent the rest of the evening in a daze, packing my belongings in the small guest house I'd been staying in. Lucas came to find me, his expression filled with anger and regret. "She can't do this," he said, his voice tight. "She can, and she will," I replied, my voice trembling. "Come with me," he said suddenly, his eyes pleading. "We'll leave together, start over somewhere else." I stared at him, my heart breaking at the sincerity in his voice. "Lucas, I can't," I said softly. "Why not?" he demanded, his frustration boiling over. "Because this isn't sustainable," I said, my tears finally spilling over. "We live in two different worlds, Lucas. And as much as I care about you, I can't lose myself in this." His expression crumbled, and for a moment I thought he might argue. But instead he nodded, his jaw tight as he stepped back. "I love you, Claire," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I love you too," I whispered, "but this is goodbye." The next morning, I left the estate. Evelyn didn't see me off, and I didn't expect her to. Lucas stood at the gate, his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes shadowed with emotion. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my chest aching with the weight of what I was leaving behind. I knew I'd never forget Lucas, the way he'd made me feel, the way he'd reminded me that I was still capable of love and desire, but I also knew it was time to move on. Leaving the Carter estate felt like ripping off a bandage that had fused to my skin. The drive away was both liberating and devastating. With every mile I put between myself and the grand gates of Evelyn's world, I felt lighter and yet more hollow. The ache in my chest was something I hadn't prepared for. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the polished circles Evelyn Carter dominated. It was modest. Peeling paint, an oven that only worked on good days. But it was mine. I spent the first few days unpacking my life into the bare space, trying to distract myself from the storm of emotions swirling inside me. But it was impossible not to think about Lucas. Every quiet moment brought memories of him rushing back. The way he'd smiled at me when no one else was watching, the warmth of his hands on mine, the whispered confessions we'd shared late at night. I'd never meant for it to go so far. At first I thought I'd only miss the thrill of it, the forbidden nature of our connection, the stolen glances, the quiet risks. But it was more than that. Lucas had seen me in a way no one else had, peeling back the layers of professionalism and detachment I'd built around myself for years. And I missed him for it. But I also knew I'd done the right thing by leaving. Our worlds were too different, and I wasn't naive enough to think we could have built a life together, not with Evelyn's wrath hanging over us like a storm cloud. I threw myself into work, taking on freelance projects and organizing events for smaller clients who didn't carry Evelyn's shadow. The jobs weren't glamorous, but they were steady, and for the first time in years I felt a sense of control over my own life. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers of the Carters in passing. Evelyn's latest business move, Lucas's art exhibit making waves in a downtown gallery. I tried not to think about what he was doing or whether he still thought of me. But on the nights when the loneliness crept in, I couldn't help but wonder if he'd moved on, if he'd found someone who fit more seamlessly into his life. It wasn't until I received an email weeks later that I finally let myself face the truth of what we'd shared. It came late one evening, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine and my laptop open on the coffee table. The subject line was simple: thinking of you. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding as I clicked. The message was short, just a few sentences. "Claire, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I needed to say it. Thank you for everything. You changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand, and I'll never forget you. I hope you're happy, wherever you are." Lucas first read it 3 times before setting the laptop aside, tears blurring my vision. His words were both a comfort and a reminder of everything we couldn't have. I wanted to respond, to tell him that I missed him too, that he'd changed me as much as I'd changed him. But I didn't. Some things were better left unsaid. Over time, the pain of leaving Lucas began to fade, replaced by a quiet gratitude for what we'd shared. Our affair had been messy, reckless, and fraught with risks, but it had also been real. He reminded me of what it felt like to be wanted, to be seen, to be alive. After years of playing it safe, of burying myself in work to avoid the emptiness left by my divorce, Lucas had shown me that I was still capable of passion and connection. But he'd also shown me the importance of knowing when to walk away. 6 months later, I found myself in a different city, working for a nonprofit that organized art programs for underprivileged youth. It was a far cry from the high-stakes world of Evelyn Carter, but it felt right. One afternoon, as I walked through the program's makeshift gallery, admiring the children's work, I spotted a painting that stopped me in my tracks. It was a bold, colorful piece, abstract but unmistakably familiar. The brushstrokes reminded me of Lucas. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the canvas as a wave of emotions washed over me. It wasn't his work. I checked the name of the young artist scrawled in the corner, but it felt like a piece of him had found its way to me. I smiled, a small private smile, and moved on. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. My time with Lucas wasn't perfect. It was complicated and fraught with mistakes. But it was also beautiful in its own way, a fleeting moment of connection that reminded me of who I was beneath the layers of responsibility and fear. Life is messy, and love doesn't always fit neatly into the boxes we want it to. But sometimes, the mess is what makes it worth living. And while I knew I'd never see Lucas again, a part of him would always stay with me, in the way I approached the world, in the risks I was finally willing to take, in the courage I found to start over. As I stepped out into the crisp evening air, the city lights stretching out before me, I felt a quiet sense of peace. Life was still unfolding, and I was ready for whatever came next.